You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 278 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm going to lead off on today's show by talking about a pretty frequent topic of this show, Senate Joint Resolution 54. This would invoke the War Powers Act to kill the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. Absolutely essential support that the United States provides. And we're going to have some progress. We're going to have a debate on it in the Senate. And so I want to talk about that for the first few minutes, at least, of today's show, just because it's really, probably one of the most important, things that, by making calls to your congressman, you could change right now. So, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, Libertarian Institute, for all of my work. The podcast is on there. I post in the blog section. I have a daily news roundup. Monday through Friday, I post, 10, 15 or so news stories about things that are going on around the world, give a 1 or 2 sentence summary of them. And so, if you're into the foreign policy stuff, which I'm guessing you are, I post a lot of police state stuff on there, economics, a lot of corruption type stuff I try to get up on there, and just general ways that the state abuses the people. All that, libertarianinstitute.org. Last, if you really support what I do, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I've had some new tiers there if you're interested in that. If you have any suggestions on rewards I could offer that would make it so you want to give to this show, go ahead and do that. I'm going to do one promotion. I'll be recording the first episode this weekend. I'm going to call it Immersion News Radio. Probably 3 or 4 episodes a month on things about other than, foreign policy. So if you want to hear me talk about the police state or something like that, check out, my Patreon page and donate to the show there. All right, let's get into it. Senate Joint Resolution 54. So if, you're calling your congressman, or I guess senator on this one is where you need to call. That's the, official name of the bill. And what we have is a procedural vote that occurred on this bill, and it's going to allow for a debate on it. This bill, as I explained in the intro, invokes the War Powers Act to end the United States support for Saudi Arabia's role in the Yemen war. The vote count was 63 to 37, so that's a solid majority that voted for it, not quite a 2/3 majority. All 37 dissenting votes were Republicans. Kind of, what you would expect, the, either insane lunatic, right-wing types like Ted Cruz, all vote no, as well as, the more establishment, Ben Sasse, Mitch McConnell type of Republican. However, you do have a good number of Republicans who end up voting yes on this measure, which, the usual Rand Paul and Mike Lee, who seems to at least have some standards of morality. And then, some never Trump types like Jeff Flake, and some Republicans who apparently just, either look at Twitter occasionally or, watch an actual report on this Yemen war and just realize that it's an absolute horror show the United States is involved in here. All the Democrats go along with it, so, they could give themselves a pat on the back for this one. But here's the thing, this isn't actually passing the bill, which is really unfortunate that you had to, just celebrate the fact that we're going to actually have a debate on the bill. I mean, let's be honest, this should have happened when the United States got involved in the Yemen war with Saudi Arabia back in March of 2015. Back then, and for the first 3.5 years of this war, until I think, a couple weeks after the Khashoggi murder, so mid-October, the United States is providing even mid-air refueling to the Saudi bombers as they're dropping American-made bombs in American-made planes on Yemen. And so, this is a time where it's very clear that what the Obama administration then is doing is in violation of the War Powers Act. We're actively assisting an army, making it possible for them to wage war on the people of Yemen and against, what they would claim be the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Now, the Houthis aren't actually backed by Iran, and I've discussed this topic on the show several times, and while I'm just here real quick, if you think it would be helpful for me to do a 30-minute in-depth show reviewing the history of the Yemen civil war, debunking the most common myths, and explaining, in the more nuanced detail exactly why and what is happening there. I can certainly do that again. However, I've done it on several shows. I think still the best review is probably episode 159. I'll link to it in the show notes page. But I'm willing to do it again. I don't enjoy talking about the Yemen war because of how horrific it is, but I do have a pretty good memory of it as I've read the news about it pretty much every day since it started. But even now that the U.S. isn't providing the mid-air refueling for Saudi Arabia, the maintenance on the planes, the arming, providing bombs and different types of military equipment to Saudi Arabia, which makes the war possible. Let's not forget here that the Houthis have very few offensive military capabilities that they could wage against the Saudi Arabia, And so for the Saudis, it's like a zero risk war, especially since the United States provides missile defense systems as well, just to take out, the few things that the Houthis actually lob against Saudi Arabia, which are ballistic missiles. And it's also interesting to note that the Houthis are considered a terrorist organization, but it's not like we're reading stories about Houthis or Zaidi Shia walking themselves into downtown Riyadh and blowing themselves up. And we provide logistical and targeting support, but I think with the maintenance and the bombs and all that kind of stuff, Rand Paul had pointed out in a recent speech that the Saudis really won't be able to continue this war without that American support for more than a month or so. There's also the fact that in the Red Sea and off the coast of Yemen, the United States, and I guess in the Gulf of Aden as well, the United States enforces, what they call the rules of navigation of that area. But what Saudi Arabia lays out as the rules of navigation are an inspection regime against commercial and aid ships that are trying to get to Yemen that essentially amounts to a blockade because nothing is really able to enter the country. Or if it is, it ends up getting spoiled. And what little gets through is barely enough to, keep up with the mounting humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Just to touch on some quick numbers here, because I think numbers are always helpful if you're trying to explain this thing. The Save the Children estimates that 85,000 children have starved to death or have died of preventable diseases because a census started this war, and that date starts in April of 2015. ACLED, a group that tracks deaths in Yemen, has so far been able to count. So this isn't just saying an estimate, based on the number of battles or whatever, but has actually been able to verify that 57,000 people have been killed due to this conflict. So people shot, people bombed, etc. This does include fighters, but they estimate that they're going to be able to count 70 to 80,000 more. And so, we're already talking about deaths in the hundreds of thousands. It's absolutely crazy, the number of people who are dropping dead from this war. Several groups are reporting that 14 million people in Yemen. Remember, Yemen's a country of 26 million or so people. 14 million of them are on the brink of famine. These people are right now saving themselves. They're not dying. They're not dropping dead because they're boiling leaves and they're eating the mush. And to further highlight the importance of this Senate move and supporting this Senate bill is the fact that, the United States has so far blocked any real UN Security Council resolutions that in any way condemn Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia plays geopolitics pretty well and have done things like remove themselves from a blacklist of countries that bomb children because the UN looked at what was going on here and they said, oh my God, Saudi Arabia's air campaign right now, the bombs that they're dropping on Yemen are killing children at an alarming rate. This is terrible. It cannot happen. And Saudi Arabia blackmailed the UN and got themselves off of that list. However, the United States also holds veto power at the Security Council, and this is the one body in the UN that can really do things with teeth. And, the U.S. being here has really been the political cover that Saudi Arabia has needed. Even recently, the U.S. ally, and, been a U.S. ally throughout this war in Yemen, the United Kingdom, a permanent UN Security Council member, had, drafted a Security Council resolution that would call for a ceasefire and an end to the blockade within a couple of weeks. And Saudi Arabia put pressure on the UK and was able to bat this report up a couple of weeks. But now we have reports saying that the US slammed the brakes on this resolution, which means it's not going anywhere. So we can't look to the UN to get any relief. And not that I'm a person that is any believer in UN or world government ever working, and here's a perfect example of why. But, this would be a place where you could, get some pressure to relieve this war, without taking violent means like bombing Saudi Arabia. And so, we really have to hope that the U.S. withdraws their support here because, as Rand Paul points out, that a couple months and the bombing campaign really dries up. We've seen that the Saudi-backed ground campaign in Yemen has made little progress against the Houthis. They've been trying for months to take this city of Hodeidah, and while, for a lot of that time it's been ceasefires, it's because the Houthis are repeatedly cutting the supply lines to the offensive force there and really able to repel them. And I'm sure a part of this is that, as Nasser Arabi has argued on the Scott Horton show, the people of Hodeidah have taken up arms to defend the city. All right, so there you go. There's a short, I guess. I always talk more about Yemen than I intend to. Little briefing on what's going on with that bill, and hopefully that's enough information, to yell at your senator there and tell them, they absolutely cannot continue to support this. And make sure you attack, because the right seems to be the one going against this. Say you're starving little babies to death. This isn't Christianity. This isn't what it's supposed to be. This isn't morality in any way. Less interesting note here, we have an Argentinian prosecutor picking up a case against Mohammed bin Salman for crimes against humanity. The G20 is being held in Argentina right now, and I believe Mohammed bin Salman was scheduled and was actually in Argentina. I'm not sure, if he's left the country or he's staying. It doesn't sound like anything would progress here quick enough that would see Mohammed bin Salman arrested in Argentina. However, there is this kind of international practice, like a theory of universal justice, and for specific crimes like war crimes. So, if you're the commander of a militia and you tell your guys to go into a village and, rape and murder every last woman, and your country chooses not to prosecute you, and you go to a different country, then those countries, some of them have laws and believe in this practice called universal justice, which says that, they would then be able to prosecute you. Now, in Argentina, I think there's quite a few legal hurdles to pass here, including, proving that Saudi Arabia isn't taking action and that there's action to be taken. But, maybe taking up a case in the, on individual country levels here, like in Argentina and other countries doing it, is a way for them to, bypass the United States at the United Nations and put some international pressure on Saudi Arabia here. But it'd be awesome to see Mohammed bin Salman arrested for these war crimes, because that's absolutely what's happening here. The best argument for this, of course, is the fact that Saudi Arabia has just absolutely decimated civilian targets in Yemen, schools, hospitals, farms. Martha Mundy describes it as a food war because they're bombing flocks of sheep to make sure those children in Yemen really do starve to death. Other notes on the G20, December 1st on the sidelines there, Trump and Putin will be having a meeting. I think the most kind of critical thing going on right now is related to this meeting, of course, is the situation in the Sea of Azov, in the Black Sea, in the Strait of Kerch, the connecting body there, where you had some Ukrainian ships attempting to violate the Russian rules of navigation, and those ships were seized by Russia, and so Ukraine in response has declared martial law. There's a fantastic episode of the Scott Horton show where he interviews Matt Blumenthal on the subject. Matt is a real sharp guy when it comes to Ukraine, and while this issue is mainly centered around the fact that Ukraine's government is embedded with neo-Nazis, and the U.S. support for the Ukrainian government has become de facto support for these Nazis who are now training white supremacist groups in the United States. But they also do touch on, how that political situation in Ukraine is really impacting what's going on here in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov. Russia released some video, so I guess you had to kind of take it, for what it is, which is Russian release video, but they recorded these sailors of the Ukrainian ships saying that they were, received orders and fully intended to violate what they knew were the Russian rules of the water there. And so, at the very least, you could say that the Ukrainians knew what they were doing and that their ships were being boarded. And this was in no way a surprise attack by Russia. I want to clarify something from the last show. It does seem that Russia has not blocked any commercial passage through the strait, which, they control there from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov. And I think on the last show, I was talking about the faction of East Ukraine that has broken away and are kind of, pro-Russian separatists. And that's the Donbass region. I think I might have mispronounced it or confused it with a different thing, but I just want to make sure I got that right on this show. Of course, the other really important issue for Trump and Vladimir Putin to talk about is the Syrian civil war, where there's just very small pockets of ISIS left. There's one region where there's a heavy number of rebels and people still in armed opposition to the Assad government. But it's quickly becoming a time where what was once Syria proper is now divided between the east and the west side of the Euphrates River. On one side, the Russian and Iranian-backed Assad government, and on the other side, a U.S.-backed Kurdish fighting force. And so, there has to be some kind of peaceful resolution to this conflict. We can't have a U.S.-Russian proxy war here. And honestly, I don't think the Kurds or the Assad government are really interested in that as well. And so Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin could play a very important and critical role in easing the suffering of the people of Syria by working on some kind of agreement and reunification here that's going to allow the people of Syria some freedom, some more freedom and autonomy from the central government in Syria, while still retaining some kind of order in the state so we don't end up with another ISIS, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, etc. situation. One very complicating factor in all of this is Turkey, which has some relationship with both the United States and the Russian government. Although I have to say, I don't know for what reason, but it really seems like Donald Trump is siding heavily against Turkey when it comes to Syria and when it comes to Saudi Arabia with the Khashoggi stuff, which very interesting that the NATO ally gets such a short end of the stick when, the non-NATO Arab allies are acting so irrationally in the Middle East. But the United States announced they're planning on training another 30,000 Kurdish fighters to add to a border force there. And then there have been some recent attacks, cross-border attacks, of artillery shelling from Turkey into Kurdish-held Syria, as well as Turkey massing some troops on that border there. And so the United States has now taken up a bunch of observation posts. I actually got this from the Inherent Resolve, which is the U.S. mission. It's the official Twitter account, posted that the U.S. Forces are securing manned observation posts along this border. So it really seems like a situation like we had in Manbij a while back, which is, U.S. troops are going to essentially be what's keeping our NATO allies from attacking our Kurdish allies. And it seems like just, if you're a Trump, if you're American first, if you really believe, that the lives of the Americans are that important, why would you make them shields? These are the guys that are standing in the way of the bullets. They're human barriers. And, that he would treat our troops that way seems like a real insult to me. Now, there is still a pocket of ISIS fighters along the Euphrates Valley and the southern half of Syria there. The U.S.-backed Kurds have been fighting them to little success, really in the past 6 months. I was talking to Will Porter, frequent guest of the show, a couple days ago, and we are just kind of cracking jokes about how, the United States has now put out another statement that they're about to crush the last remaining pocket of ISIS in Syria. And this is, did they copy and paste or do they keep rewriting it? Because they've announced this several times over the past year. Recent fighting between the U.S.-backed Kurds and ISIS has resulted in 200 deaths. 51 of those deaths are civilians killed by the U.S. coalition's airstrikes. At least 100 are from the U.S. Kurdish forces, and I'm not sure how many ISIS fighters have been killed. But, this isn't a very successful and quick operation. And with Turkey, being more and more aggressive and provocative on the other borders of Syria and Kurdistan, it's really drawing a lot of Kurdish attention away. I think this is why we've seen a little bit of an increase in U.S. airstrikes in Syria. Lots more civilians killed in the past month or so in Syria than in prior months. And it just doesn't seem like this fighting is going well. Israel-Palestine. It's been a while since I talked about this, and there's probably a lot I need to catch up on and I missed. Should probably have somebody on the show for that at some point. But a couple just figures that I think are very telling about the situation there. 6,000 Gazan protesters have been shot with live fire with actual bullets so far in the 8 months of protests at the border fence there. It's a very good article. I'll link to it in the show notes page, but it even goes as far and breaks down how far away people from the fence were when they were shot. Many people well over 150 meters away from the fence are being shot. And so, you're talking about a distance, a football field and the half thereabouts of people standing away from the fence, and Israeli snipers shooting these unarmed people, mostly in the lower limbs. It's a disgusting practice. It should be condemned, and it's mainly right now not being. In total, some 24,000 Gazan protesters have been injured in these months. There's other people shot with rubber-coated steel bullets, severe cases of tear gas poisoning and stuff like this. It's just absolutely terrible. And the people are doing it because, they really don't have much to live for. They're blockaded on all sides. They only get fuel when the Israelis are letting them. There's like 50% unemployment. Most of the people there are refugees from other areas of Israel. They can only fish a couple miles off the coast, and it's really limited. They talked about sea blockades of Yemen. Aid ships, attempting to either bring people who are facing amputations out of Gaza, to Cyprus, or flotillas trying to bring aid like wheelchairs in are intercepted and stopped. And so the people are outraged. They live lives in terrible conditions. That's enforced on them by the Israeli government and the Israeli military. And so they're protesting and they're being shot, and even that's being ignored. Elsewhere in Israel, you have less terrible but still terrible treatment of the Palestinians. In Jerusalem alone, and in November, over 30 Palestinian buildings have been destroyed by the Israeli government. This is a slow progress that they've been doing of just taking more and more Palestinian land, and it never goes into the hands of Palestinians. Even if they maybe retain ownership of the property, it's often impossible for them to get building permits. 90+% of the building permits go to Israelis. Only a very small percentage of Palestinians ever get building permits to improve or, rebuild their homes after they've been destroyed. Last story I thought was interesting. I'm not sure, how much analysis I have on it, but I just wanted to bring it up. The FBI has 5,000 active terrorist investigations. Now, I don't think this number is exclusive to foreign terrorism, and so how many of these are against kind of like U.S. neo-Nazis or environmental terrorists, I'm not sure. But they say a lot of the people are radicalized lone wolves that they're going after. 5,000 is a lot, though. I mean, if you think about that, that's more than one new case being opened up a day here. And so it would be interesting to know, if they open up an investigation on you, what can they look at of yours? What kind of evidence is still considered, or what kind of parts of your information are still considered protected? What isn't? And, what does it mean to be under a terrorism investigation by the FBI? Because if there's 5,000 active ones, it means they're surveilling an awful lot of people here. And we know there's not like 5,000 terrorist attacks going on every year. And so you have to wonder how many completely innocent people are being surveilled and investigated here. All right. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. My news website is immersionnews.com. Check that out. Minds.com/immersionnews. Minds is a crypto social network. I absolutely love it. I post there more frequently than I post on Twitter or Facebook combined. So definitely check that out. And for those of you patrons who really support the show, you'll be getting another episode over the weekend. And for everybody else, I'll be back on Monday.